Welcome everyone to this TestRail webinar. Today we're here to talk about the TestRail API. So this is not about API testing, this is about how to integrate your tools with TestRail using the TestRail API. About today's webinar, the agenda is over here. So we're going to start with a little TestRail API introduction, then talk a little bit about authentication and rate limiting, the entities and endpoints you can use, the anatomy of an API call, a little very basic concepts, and then some hands-on, so how you can create test plans in TestRail, how you can create configurations for those test plans, so you can play around with different browsers, test runs for different browsers, for instance, and also how to create those test runs and embed the results for the test runs based on whatever source you are using. This maybe automation, maybe some other platform for your test results. Anything is valid here. Let's start with an intro to the TestRail API. So the TestRail API is an HTTP API. It uses the JSON format for the requests. So the payloads, either the ones in your requests or on the responses, will be in JSON format. And the encoding is UTF-8. With our current architecture, you use the get verb to retrieve data and the post verb to submit data. It's also a very secure API, so it has basic authentication where you can use your username and your password, or over here I have written API key because that's a safer method. That's what you should use. You should generate an API key and not use your password directly. And it has resource access control as well, so everyone only has access to what they should have access to. And it's a very flexible API, so you can get page lists of entities, you can manage entities individually or using bulk operations, among other things, and you can manage virtually any entity in TestRail. What are the typical usage scenarios for our API? Well, a lot of people use the API to submit test results from automated tests. I'd say this is the biggest use case we have. But you can also use it to migrate test cases from legacy systems. You can query information for integrations, or you can synchronize data between different systems. Let's say some dashboarding tool, some BI tool you might want to use, and you need to extract data from your TestRail instance. You can also do that through the API. And here is a list of examples of integrations. So this is split in different sections. So automation frameworks, you can integrate test results from Cypress, Playwright, JUnit, PyTest, all the usual suspects when it comes to test automation, among others. There's a lot more. You can also do this from your CI and CD tools. So from Jenkins, GitHub Actions, GitLab CI, Travis CI, etc. You should be able to run your tests, your automated tests using your preferred framework in any of these tools and then send the results back to TestRail, and also maybe even create test cases in TestRail from these tools as well. And then there are some other tools like Global App Testing that uses our API to integrate with us to submit results from their external testers, Functionize, which is also a test automation platform, Catalan as well, and the JetBrains IDEs also have a plugin which you can use to fetch the information from your test cases into your JetBrains IDE and then generate skeletons for your automated tests. So quite a couple of things you can do already. Technicalities, authentication and rate limiting. There is an authentication that secures the APIs you are using with TestRail. And to access the API, you need to use the basic authentication, HTTP basic authentication scheme. To do that, all you need is to send in a header, such as the one you can see here with the authorization header, which is basic. And then this is an encoded version of your username and your API key or your password. And if you don't get the authentication right, you'll get the 401 authentication failed status code, but you should be able to get this fairly easy. We are going to showcase how you can achieve this in our demo. And then there's also the authorization part. So according to your configurations, how your administrator configures your TestRail instance, people will be able to access one or another endpoint or some of the resources from one endpoint and not others, depending on their permission. So this is all customizable, and it's also very flexible. If you don't have, for instance, access to one project, you'll be receiving a 403 access denied status code. So if you get this one, you probably need to check if you have access to the resource you are trying to fetch. About rate limiting, so for cloud, there's rate limiting. These are the values: 180 requests per minute for professional and 300 for enterprise. We do this so we don't get overloaded with requests, which would naturally be bad for your own instance of TestRail. And how can you manage this rate limiting? So a lot of times you are submitting a lot of results and you may not be doing it. Sometimes you may not be doing it in the most efficient way, because you should always try to use endpoints that allow bulk operations. But in case you have to use endpoints that only, for instance, create one test at a time, and you have a lot of tests you want to create, then you will probably be facing this rate limiting. And what happens is you get this status code. So the 429 too many requests status code. And how can you circumvent this? Well, not circumvent, but you can adjust to this. If you check, you'll have a header that's called retry after, and it has a number of seconds after which you can retry your request. So in your scripts, you should accommodate for this scenario. And you should just, if you receive this status code, you should wait these seconds before you perform another request, and you should be good. About entities and endpoints in TestRail, an important thing before getting started with using the API, or even for whoever is using the UI, the interface of TestRail, to do any sort of action, you should understand how TestRail is structured, how our entities relate to each other. To start with, you have different kinds of projects. So you have single repository project, you have a single repository with baseline support, and you have multiple test suites. When it comes to API usage, the first one, the single repository, will only have one suite, while the others will have multiple suites. So you'll have to manage multiple suites. That's the only difference from an API perspective. What does this mean? If you have a multi-suite project, you won't be able to share entities across suites. So for instance, if you have your cases over here in this suite, in this first suite, and you have some more cases in this suite, you can't create one test run that has all the cases. They are separated, and this is how it works in the UI, and this is how it works on the API side as well. So although in the UI, for instance, the test runs, you can see all of them in one page, but every test run is dedicated to one suite. So when you create a test run, you have to select the suite, and you have to select cases from that suite. And from there, you execute your tests and you get your results. But please be aware that there's this separation. For test design purposes, so we have our project entity. Inside the project, we can have one or more suites. And inside each suite, you can organize your tests using sections and subsections. A subsection is just a section that has a parent section, so it's the same entity. And then you can have cases inside the section, inside subsections. You can basically manage this however you want. It's sort of a folder structure. As for test execution, you also have to manage this within suites. And you have, for instance, your test runs that may be isolated. You have test runs that may be aggregated by a test plan. And then you can aggregate both test runs and test plans inside milestones. So you have this higher level organization, so you can track multiple results from multiple test runs and test plans in only one place. How do cases relate to test runs and test results? So the concept of case in TestRail is what you usually call a test case. It's where you write your script for your test. So you have this entity where you have your test steps, or you have your, let's say, your exploratory session, or whatever format you're using. And then it works as a template, which is expanded into multiple tests using test runs. So for instance, if you have a test run, you can execute this test case, and you can have multiple results for the test case. So this is how cases relate to tests and to results. But tests only exist inside test runs as well as results, and this is their relationship. As for endpoints, we have a ton of endpoints. Like I mentioned, you can manage virtually any entity in TestRail. So you have endpoints for cases, for runs, for results, for tests. you can either read or write. So you can, for instance, the get endpoints usually are used to get information on, in this case, for a test case. You can get one case, you can get multiple cases at once, you can get history, then you can also add a case, you can copy cases from one place to the other, you can update, you can move, you can do, like I said, almost anything you can do within the UI, you should be able to also do within the API. The anatomy of an API call. These are just very basic concepts. I'm not going to dig very deep into this. For an HTTP API, you usually have a request and you have a response, an HTTP request and response. And usually a request will be composed by these elements. So a method, which can be any verb like a get, a post, a put, etc. In our API, we only use get and post. Then you have your host. This is what you're targeting, and the path to your resource. So in this case, we would be targeting the get projects endpoint, which would return the projects. You can also have query parameters, which would be attached to the URL over here. For instance, you can filter your project. So you just want projects that are not completed, the projects that are still active. You can also send some headers like accept, so your application, so the API knows what you are expecting as a response, and it will send you a response, in this case in JSON. And you can also send a body. Bodies are usually only for post requests, not so much for get requests, and this is where you send the data you want to write in TestRail. And then the response usually contains a status code, some headers, like the content type, since we were requesting a JSON, the content type would be JSON, and then the body could be anything, any data you are trying to request. So this is sort of a request that is closer to reality. So this would be a get to a run. So we are trying to use the get run endpoint here. We need to add the run ID to the path. And we send in the headers, which is the accept application JSON, the type of data we want to accept, and also our authorization, because like I mentioned, you always need to authenticate. And then it would return something like this, like a status code, could be 200, could be one of the other ones, the error codes, like usually in the 400 and 500s, then the headers. And then the body, in this case, it would return, for instance, the run ID, the run name, the description, etc. And we are going to go straight to our demo. We will be using Postman to demonstrate everything. And the use case we are going to demonstrate is around the test plans, test configurations, and then submitting test runs and results. I'll give more details in the demo itself. In this TestRail API usage example, we will build the HTTP requests required to implement the submission of cross-browser test results using test plans and configurations in order to keep the test runs aggregated. To accomplish this, we will be using Postman, a very popular tool to interact with HTTP APIs with a very intuitive interface so you can follow along. I already have a collection with the necessary requests in place, so we will only have to tailor them to achieve our goal. I also have an environment with variables with the details to access the TestRail instance we'll use. This is my collection, and these are all the requests we have to make to achieve our use case and goal. I also have my environment, like I mentioned, so this TestRail instance environment contains the variables that we'll need to use across all requests. So it has our TestRail API URL, which has our base URL for our TestRail instance, and then the path to hit the API v2 endpoints. And I'm going to use this user email to demo, and I need an API password. We could use the user password directly here, but we recommend using the API key, and I'm going to show you how you can fetch that. This is my TestRail instance. This is where we are going to create our entities through the API. And I have a multi-suit project in place here, so we can use it and add a little bit more complexity because it's not a single suit. We need to take care of adding the entities to the right suit. But let's go to our user area, to my settings up here on the top right, and I'm going to open this in a new tab. this is where we are going to generate our API key. So you go to the API keys section and you click add key. You can give it any name. So over here, I'm going to call it API integrations, and I'm just going to click add generate key. And then I'm going to copy this key and I'm going to click add key to finalize this. And you also need to click save settings before your key is active. So let's do that. Our settings were saved and I can now close this tab. Let's go back to our Postman tool over here and we'll add the API key to our API password variable. We can now move on to actually execute our requests. I'm first going to save the environment by hitting Ctrl S. Now that we've saved it, we can go to our collections and let's start executing our requests. So the first request, just to check if connectivity is okay, will be get projects. We don't actually need this request for the use case, but this is a request that any user can execute, and it's an easy one. All we need is to say that we want to do a get request, add the variable for our TestRail API URL. This is the variable, we can see the value over here, and then the endpoint is get projects, and we can just execute this by clicking send. It's sending the request, and we can see that the authentication failed here at the bottom of the screen. What this means is that we haven't set up our credentials yet, we haven't set up authentication, so let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to set it up at the collection level, so it applies to all the requests. So I'm going to authorization, and the type of authorization for TestRail should be basic auth. I'm just going to add my variables here. So it should be the API username, also the API password. I can now save this element here, close this, we go back to our projects, get projects endpoint, and let's hit it again by clicking send. Now we have some data being returned, so everything went right. We can see our status code was 200 OK, so this is good. And then we have our list of projects. Now we have achieved connectivity with our TestRail instance and we are authenticated. Let's now implement our actual use case. After we're done, what we should see in TestRail is a test plan with 2 test runs, one for each browser configuration, and some test results. So the first step is adding a test plan. To do that, we are going to use the post add plan endpoint. We are going to execute a post request to the add plan endpoint, and we just need to replace the project ID. To find the project ID, you can go to your TestRail instance. If we are on the test suites and test cases page, we can see the project ID on the URL. So this is the project ID, it's 24. So let's copy this and let's go back to Postman and replace it here. Then we need to add a body, so a payload. It should be a JSON payload, so you just select raw in Postman and then the type should be JSON and you enter a JSON format here. I already have my template here. I'm just going to replace the plan name with cross-browser test plan. And we can send this request and see the response. Here we have our response, so it was we got 200 OK, and we can see it returns the ID of our new test plan and the name that we sent in, and a couple of other parameters that right now we don't need to be concerned with. If we go to our TestRail instance and we go to test runs and results, we should see our cross-browser test plan here without any results, any test runs. That's the next step to actually add the test runs to this test plan. Let's go back to Postman. And now we are going to execute the post add plan entry request. This is a post request to the add plan entry endpoint. We can see that it requires a plan ID, so it knows to which plan to add this entry. So what we need to do is go back to the add plan request, because we know that it returned the ID of the new plan. So here is the ID. on the response, and we are going to add the ID right here on the URL. Next thing, we need to fill a couple of parameters on our body. So again, this is a body, a JSON body. We need to fill in the run name, so let's call it UI tests. We need to fill in the suit ID because we have multiple suits and we need to add these test runs to one suit. We need to find out the suit we want to use. Let's go back to TestRail and go to test suits and cases. We can see that we have two suits. We had already seen this before, and we want to add our test results to the UI tests. So let's open this suit. We can see the suit ID on the URL. The suit ID is 49. Let's copy it and go back to Postman and add the suit ID. Next thing we need is configurations, because we want these runs to be associated to the respective browser. We need configuration IDs. How do we find these? Well, we need to actually execute a request to the configuration groups endpoint, which we have here. It's a get configuration groups. We can see that we have the get configs endpoint, and it requires a project ID because the configurations are created by project. We already know our project ID, so it's the project we use the add plan endpoint on, so it's the 24. This is the ID. So let's add the ID over here and let's execute this request to see what configurations we have available, and it returned an empty array. So right now we don't have any configuration groups or configurations, so we need to create these. How do we do that? Through the API. You could do that via the UI, but let's do it through the API. First, you need to add a configuration group. Again, you need to add the project ID. It's the add config group endpoint, and it requires a project ID, which you already know it's 24. It requires a body with the name for this configuration group, and we are going to call it browsers. And let's send this request to create our configuration group. And now we have a configuration group named browsers, and the ID of this configuration group is 15. This is the ID we will want to associate our configurations with. And now we are going to use the post add configuration endpoint. This endpoint requires a configuration group ID, so we already know that it's 15, and we can now add configurations. Our configurations, like I mentioned before, will be our browsers. So let's say it's Chrome, and I'm going to send this to create the first configuration, and we have our configuration. Now I also want another one named Safari, and I'm going to send the request, and we see that it was successfully created. Now if we do the get configs request again, if we execute it, we will be able to see that we now have a configuration group. Under that configuration group we have our browsers. So here are the configurations, and the configuration group name is browsers. So now we have our configurations, and we can go back to our plan entry and actually use these configurations. On the entry object, we need to add config IDs. So over here we need to add all the configurations we want to use in this entry, and we are going to use an array with the IDs. So let me go back to our get request, and let's see the IDs of our configurations. So it's 36 and 37. Now going back to our plan entry, and I'm going to insert 36 and 37. I have my list of runs, which right now would include all tests. Maybe we will want to change this. And we also have our configuration IDs. So the first one we want to use 36, so this will be our Chrome run, and for the other one we will want to use 37, so this will be our Safari run. I don't think we want to include all test cases, so let's just include a few, because this is usually what happens when you are importing results from somewhere else. You can see the case IDs in your TestRail interface. So for instance, here we have all the IDs for all our test cases. The ID is the numeric part over here, so the C doesn't count. So this should be the ID. We're just going to use 3 just for this example. So I'm going to add this case, this one and this one. So these are sequential IDs, and I'm going to use the same for our Safari run. I need to say that we are not going to include all test cases. If we leave this as true, then it would include all test cases, and that's not our goal here. So now we have our name for our test run, our suit ID, our config IDs, the cases we want to add to our runs. So we can execute this request. We can see that it returned our runs with a couple of parameters for each run. We have our first run ID over here. We have our second run ID over here. Right now they don't have any test results, so the statistics are all for untested count, which is exactly what we wanted to achieve. If we now go back to our TestRail instance and go to test runs and results, we should see that our cross-browser test plan now has 6 tests which are untested, exactly like we've just seen in the request. And if we open this, we can see that we have an entry. The entry is UI tests, and this entry has 2 test runs, one run for Chrome and one run for Safari. Actually, if we go to edit, we can also see the configurations. Through the UI, what you would do would be adding a test suite and then going to configurations, and you could add a group here and then add the configurations, which was what we did through the API. So everything went according to what we expected. Let's cancel this since we didn't make any changes to our test plan. Now it's time to submit some results. So let's go back to Postman. To add results, what we need to do is use the post add results for cases endpoint. What do we need here? We need the run ID. You need to add results for one run at a time. Let's go grab that run ID from our plan entry response. We're just going to add results for our first run. The ID is 221, and going back to our add results, we're going to replace this here on the URL. And now we need to submit results for our cases. And we have this template here for our results object. This is an object which has a results key, and then we have a list of results. I already have a couple of parameters we can add to the results. The mandatory parameters would be the case ID, so it knows to which case to assign the result. The status ID, in this case we have 1, this is the status ID for passed, and we have another one with 5, which is the status ID for failed. You can check the status IDs in our API reference. And we are going to add a comment, we are going to add the elapsed time as well, and you could add any other parameters, custom fields, etc. But right now we are just going with this more basic template. We can go back to our plan entry and see the test cases we added, and we can copy the IDs for the first 2 cases, for instance. So it would be 4063 and 4064. We are just going to immediately submit this request, and we can see that it was okay. There's a 200 okay status code. We can see that the results were added and it returns the results object. If we now go back to TestRail and we refresh this page, we will be able to see that the results were submitted for Chrome. So this was the run we wanted. That's the ID we picked. It's 221, and if we open this, we can see that we have all our data in here. So there's the comment and there's the elapsed time. To finalize, you could add results for the other test run as well. And just like this, we have implemented an integration, which could be, for instance, for automated test results or any other results you would fetch from any other tool. And there you have it. We have done all this implementation in just about 15 minutes. I mean, this was me doing it. I'm very aware of how the API works, so it would take a little more than that probably. But just to show you that this isn't exactly complex, at least using Postman. Obviously, if you want to do some more complex logic, you would have to use a programming language and leverage the API through the programming language. But this is how you would implement things. And you could also even extract some of the requests you need to do from Postman. It also allows you to generate requests in different programming languages. But some of you might be thinking, okay, but how does he know all that about the TestRail API? Where can we fetch information about how to implement this and how to use other endpoints as well for our use cases? So we have our documentation in support.testrail.com, and we have our API documentation under API manual. So you should definitely check this out. And what do we have here? We have the introduction to the TestRail API. So a lot of the things I've talked about today, like rate limiting, API offset and limit parameters for paging, and a lot of other stuff, how to access the TestRail API as well, authentication, how to use the username and API key for authentication. There's also some examples in our TestRail customizations GitHub repository. You can check it out. A couple of bindings. So these are libraries that sort of make it simple for you to get started with accessing the API. And then we have our reference. Our reference has all the endpoints we make available for you to use. So for instance, we were using endpoints for plans, and you can check what these endpoints, how these endpoints work by coming here. So you see all the endpoints on the table of contents, like get plan. We use the add plan and the add plan entry endpoints. And you can see what parameters they need, what the URL is for these endpoints, what they are going to return, the sort of a model of what they return. For instance, if it's an add plan, also an example of the request you might be doing. So there's a lot to explore over here. Like I said, you can manage virtually any entity. So there's a ton of things you can find in this API reference. And also, if you want to get started before actually digging into the reference, if you want to check some of the usual use cases, we also have some documentation on that. It's a good thing to quickly ramp up using the API. So for instance, over here we have examples on how to create test cases, export test cases, import and export test results. This page has a lot of the information you have already seen in this webinar. So what are the main entities in TestRail, how they are organized as well, how you can customize TestRail. One of the things we like, usually people like about TestRail is that it's very customizable. So you can create new fields and store any sort of data you want in those fields. You can customize, for instance, your results statuses as well, your templates, for writing your test cases too. So there's a lot you can do with this. And let me just show you, for instance, the import test results use cases. So over here we have a couple of real world use cases. So the TestRail CLI, which is a CLI tool we have created. It's an open source tool, so you can even go to our repository in GitHub and check the code there, the code we use to make the requests. It's written in Python, by the way. And then also Functionize also sends their results to TestRail through our API, Catalan as well, global app testing. We had already mentioned this during the presentation. And then you have some examples on how to create your test runs. So creating a simple test run, and then adding results using the case ID, an example of how you can do that. We already showed this in the demo as well. You can see some extra information on custom fields, on the statuses as well. Some templates, for instance, if you are using a template, a case template with separated test steps, and you want to submit a result that has the result for each step, you can also do that. And we have a template of the request you need to execute with this payload. So you would send in this custom step results object over here. So also how to import attachments for your test results. There's quite a few goodies in here, so do take a look and check this out. And now to our Q&A. So first question from Swarnando Das. So Swarnando says, I would like to start the actual BDD test on TestRail and use robot framework to automate the same tests. Can I integrate these so that I can trigger the test run from TestRail and get results there as well? Well, we usually recommend using the TestRail CLI to do this. And how I would recommend going about doing this you want to achieve would be to first create the BDD test cases in TestRail. We have a BDD template, but I don't know if that would actually fit your use case. You probably would be better off creating a custom template. And then from there, you could either export the test using the get endpoint to robot framework, or if you already have them written in robot framework, then you can also import them using either our CLI or using the API. About triggering the test run, it would depend on the CI tool you are using. So we use UI scripts in TestRail, which allow you to create some sort of trigger button inside TestRail in the UI that would trigger your test run somewhere, but you would have to make sure that you could actually execute that request and that your tool would accept the request through its API. But it's definitely doable, but it's not an easy implementation. If you go to our documentation and go to test automation and then TestRail CLI, you could either go to the code first or specification first workflows. But using, for instance, the specification first workflow, this is what I would see working for you. What you would do is you would create your test cases inside TestRail, and then you would code your test cases. You would add the IDs to match your cases in TestRail, and then you would run your test cases in whichever platform and get the results back to TestRail using, and once again, you can use either our CLI or you can use the API to do that. Then Sandeep is asking, can we use the TestRail API with Swift XCUI test automation test for updating automation test results? If yes, do you have any documentation on how we would do this, please? If you have a way to know your test results, so you have, for instance, a report, the TestRail CLI uses a report. So if you were able to generate, for instance, a JUnit report, you could use the TestRail CLI to parse the results from that report and send them to TestRail. If you don't have a way to generate that report, but you have any other kind of report, or you know your test results during execution and you are able to implement API calls, then yes, you should be able to actually implement those calls to submit the results to TestRail. It's just a matter of leveraging the API endpoints. I have some documentation I can share. I will show that it's in C#, I believe. It uses C# as programming language, but we do have a blog post on that. I will share the link to that after this. And Matt Troutman asks, you mentioned for API authentication basic user ID plus API key encoded. How do we generate the above encoded variable? So if you're using the Postman, you can just use their authorization functionality. You select basic auth, you add your username and password. This is what you would do in most libraries and tools you are using. It would handle that for you. But if you actually need to do that, you just grab any base 64 encoding tool and you just write your email. So for instance, in this case, I'd write my email and my password with double like this, user email and then password or API key. And then you would just have something encoding the value for you, and this would be the value you would be using. So I hope that helps. And Lemon Mang is asking, why not just let use inputting the configuration by strings, TestRail maintain the IDs by itself? So usually for every API, the standard method for fetching entities is by ID, not by name, because you usually can have the same name for different entities. So IDs are the most straightforward way to get the entities, and that is what we support. I'm sorry if you have a use case where you need to get the configurations by strings, but to do that you can just do a get to configurations, see what matches, what ID matches the string you want, and then go from there. Sorry, but that's what we support as of now. I hope that helps. And Samya N is asking, in the hands-on demo, I didn't see how to attach PDF execution reports through API. Yeah, I didn't go through that use case. I believe that is in our use cases over here. So if you go to importing test results in our documentation, in our use cases, you should be able to see this importing attachments example. And so this is how you would import a PDF file or any sort of file. You first need to actually create the result for a test, and after you submit the result, so maybe that the test failed and you want to add some evidence, after you have your result ID, you would use this endpoint, the add attachment to result, and you would add the ID of the result you want your file attached to. And in this case we have an example of a curl request, and this is how you would do it. We are still improving this documentation bit, so we will be adding examples with other coding languages and more curl examples as well, so keep your eye out for that. And that's it. Thanks everyone for attending. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you can leverage our API and implement all your use cases successfully. Have a nice day, everyone. See you around.